Why Amish gardens rarely have pests, the simple stick trick modern farming forgot. Imagine planting a garden where insects simply refuse to enter. No pesticides, no sprays, no chemical dust covering the soil, just a few rough wooden sticks quietly pushed into the ground. And somehow, beetles stop at the edge. Aphids never arrive. Hornworms turn away before they reach the tomatoes. The plants grow untouched. To most modern gardeners, that sounds impossible because today we're told that protecting a garden requires an entire shelf of chemicals. But in some Amish communities, farmers have relied on a surprisingly simple trick for generations. A method so basic it costs almost nothing, yet it can protect an entire garden. And the most fascinating part? It doesn't kill the insects. It simply makes them leave. So why isn't this method taught in most gardening books? And why did so many farmers stop using it? Today, we're diving into the story behind the Amish stick method, a forgotten piece of farming knowledge that might completely change how you think about pest control in your garden. But before we talk about that forgotten method, we need to start with a problem every gardener eventually faces. Because no matter where you live, if you grow food long enough, you will meet the same enemies. Beetles, aphids, hornworms, leaf miners. It usually starts the same way every spring. You prepare the soil, you plant the seeds. The first green shoots break through the ground. A few weeks later, the garden looks incredible. Tomato plants stretch toward the sun. Lettuce leaves grow thick and vibrant. The squash vines begin to spread across the soil. For a moment, everything feels perfect. Then one morning, something changes. You walk out to check the garden and notice tiny holes in the leaves. The next day, the holes are bigger. By the end of the week, entire sections of the plant look chewed, curled, or stripped bare. Turn over a leaf and you'll see them. Clusters of aphids clinging to the stem. A fat green hornworm slowly devouring a tomato plant. Tiny beetles chewing their way across the garden like a moving army. And suddenly, the peaceful garden you imagined turns into a constant battle. In many parts of the world, pests can destroy 20 to 40% of a harvest if they aren't controlled. For farmers, that's not just frustrating. It's food lost, money lost, months of work disappearing. So, modern gardening advice usually points to the same answer. Buy pesticides, buy traps, buy treatments. Spray this, dust that. Kill the bugs before they destroy your crops. And to be fair, many of those products do work, but they also come with a cost. Some damage the soil ecosystem. Some harm beneficial insects like bees and ladybugs. And many gardeners simply don't feel comfortable spraying chemicals on the food they plan to eat. That's why a growing number of small growers, backyard gardeners, homesteaders, and people interested in self-sufficient living have started asking a different question. Not, how do I kill every insect in the garden? But something much simpler. What if the goal isn't to destroy the insects at all? What if the goal is simply to make them stay somewhere else? Because if pests never enter the garden in the first place, there's no war to fight. And that single idea leads us directly to one of the most fascinating and rarely discussed pieces of traditional farming knowledge. To understand where this idea comes from, we have to step away from modern farms for a moment and travel back to a very different kind of agriculture. Long before synthetic pesticides existed, farmers still faced the exact same problem we just talked about. Insects still ate crops. Beetles still invaded fields. Entire harvests could still disappear if pests took over. But those farmers didn't have garden centers. They didn't have shelves full of chemical sprays. What they had instead was observation. Generations of watching the land, learning which plants thrive together, and discovering small patterns that most people overlooked. In communities like the Amish, farming traditions were passed down quietly from parent to child, not through textbooks, through practice, through stories told while working the fields. And somewhere in that long chain of practical knowledge, farmers began noticing something unusual about a particular tree. A tree called Osage orange. If you've ever seen one, it's hard to forget. The branches are tough and dense. The bark is rough, and the tree produces strange green fruit about the size of a softball. But the real secret of this tree isn't the fruit. It's the wood. For reasons farmers didn't fully understand at the time, insects seemed to behave differently around freshly cut Osage orange branches. Beetles avoided them. Certain garden pests stayed away from areas where the wood had been placed. Over time, some farmers began experimenting. They cut thick branches in late autumn. They stored them in barns through the winter. Then, when spring arrived and the soil softened, they pushed those branches into the ground around their gardens. Not randomly, but spaced apart, forming a loose grid across the garden beds. And year after year, they began noticing something remarkable. While nearby fields struggled with insects, the gardens surrounded by these wooden stakes often suffered far less damage. Leaves stayed intact. Tomatoes ripened without being devoured. Entire rows of vegetables remained untouched. To outside observers, the idea sounded strange. A few sticks of wood protecting an entire garden? Most people dismissed it as coincidence or old farming superstition. But the farmers who actually used the method kept repeating the same quiet observation. The insects didn't die. They simply never seemed to cross into the garden. For a long time, nobody could explain exactly why. And for generations, the answer remained buried in the soil right alongside those wooden stakes. For a long time, the farmers who used this method didn't need a scientific explanation. They only needed the results. But as researchers began studying plant chemistry more closely, something interesting started to appear. The Osage orange tree isn't just tough wood and strange fruit. Inside that dense timber is a collection of natural compounds the tree produces to protect itself. Like many plants, the tree evolved its own defense system. Instead of running away from insects, it makes itself difficult to attack. The wood contains powerful natural oils. When the branches are freshly cut, those oils slowly release into the air and the surrounding soil. Humans barely notice the scent. But insects experience the world very differently. Most insects navigate using smell. Their antennae detect tiny chemical signals that guide them toward food. Those signals tell a beetle where a tender leaf is. They tell an aphid where new plant growth is happening. They help a hornworm find the exact tomato plant it wants to feed on. But when certain plant oils fill the air, those scent signals begin to break down. To an insect, the environment suddenly becomes confusing. The signals they rely on disappear or become distorted. And when insects lose their ability to locate food, they usually respond in the simplest way possible. They leave. Instead of moving deeper into the garden, they fly or crawl away in search of clearer signals somewhere else. In other words, the insects aren't being poisoned. They're being disoriented. And that difference matters, because killing pests often damages the larger ecosystem. But disrupting their navigation changes their behavior without wiping them out. Some researchers now believe that certain woods, including Osage orange, may release compounds strong enough to create a small repellent zone around the source, a subtle boundary where insects prefer not to travel. If enough of those zones overlap, they can form something that gardeners sometimes describe as an invisible barrier, not a wall you can see, but a chemical landscape that insects instinctively avoid. And suddenly, those quiet experiments from generations of farmers begin to make a lot more sense. And when you start to look at farming through that lens, something else becomes clear. Methods like this weren't just clever tricks. They fit perfectly into the way traditional farmers thought about growing food. Because for most of human history, agriculture wasn't about controlling nature. It was about working with it. A farmer's success depended on understanding patterns, the rhythm of the seasons, the behavior of insects, the way certain plants supported each other in the soil. And when a method worked, farmers didn't ask whether it came from a laboratory. They asked a much simpler question. Does it protect the harvest? If the answer was yes, the method stayed. The Osage orange stakes had several advantages that made them incredibly appealing to small farmers. First, they required almost no ongoing cost. Once the branches were cut and placed in the ground, the system could remain effective for years. No bottles to replace, no monthly purchases, no dependency on outside supplies. Second, the method didn't destroy the living system of the garden. Anyone who has worked with healthy soil knows that a garden is more than just plants. It's a complex ecosystem. Earthworms tunneling beneath the surface, fungi connecting plant roots underground, beneficial insects hunting the pests that threaten crops. Many chemical pesticides don't just eliminate pests, they disrupt that entire system. But a natural repellent works differently. Instead of wiping out life in the garden, it gently shifts behavior. The insects simply choose another place to feed. and the garden's ecosystem stays balanced. But there was a third reason traditional farmers valued approaches like this. It supported something deeply important to communities like the Amish: self-reliance. If a farmer could solve a problem using materials already growing on their land, that solution was incredibly powerful. A nearby tree, a sharp knife, a few hours of work. That was all it took. No suppliers, no chemicals, no waiting for deliveries, just knowledge, passed down quietly from one generation to the next. And for a long time, that kind of knowledge formed the backbone of small-scale farming. But as the 20th century unfolded, agriculture began to change in ways few farmers could have predicted. By the middle of the 20th century, farming was entering a completely new era. For thousands of years, agriculture had evolved slowly. Tools improved, seeds were selected, techniques were refined over generations. But after World War II, the pace of change accelerated dramatically. Factories that had once produced wartime chemicals suddenly had enormous manufacturing capacity, and those chemicals needed a new purpose. Agriculture quickly became the answer. Scientists developed powerful synthetic pesticides designed to eliminate insects quickly and efficiently. For large farms struggling with massive pest outbreaks, these products seemed revolutionary. A farmer could spray an entire field and watch the pests disappear within hours. For industrial agriculture, that level of control was incredibly attractive. Crops could be protected on a massive scale. Harvests became more predictable, and food production expanded rapidly. But there was another side to this transformation. Many of these chemical solutions required continuous use. Pests returned each season, and every new season meant another round of spraying. Over time, farming knowledge began to shift. Universities taught modern chemical pest management. Agricultural companies promoted the newest treatments. Garden stores filled their shelves with products designed to solve insect problems quickly. None of this necessarily meant traditional knowledge was wrong, but it slowly faded into the background. Older techniques that relied on observation, natural materials, and local ecosystems simply received less attention. They weren't standardized, they weren't easy to package, and they didn't fit neatly into the growing system of industrial agriculture. So many of those practices, the quiet experiments, the small discoveries passed down through generations, gradually disappeared from mainstream farming education. Yet, in a few communities that maintained older agricultural traditions, some of those ideas never vanished at all. The Amish were among them. While modern farms adopted tractors, chemical sprayers, and industrial inputs, Amish farmers continued working their fields much the way their grandparents had. Horse-drawn equipment, small diversified gardens, and methods built around patience, observation, and the natural behavior of the land. Which is why, even today, you can still find gardens where those simple wooden stakes quietly stand in the soil, just as they have for generations. If you visit small farms in parts of Pennsylvania, Ohio, or Indiana, you may still see a version of this method quietly in use. It doesn't look dramatic. There are no machines involved, no equipment humming in the background, just rows of vegetables, and occasionally a few weathered wooden stakes standing quietly in the soil. At first glance, most people wouldn't think twice about them. They look like ordinary pieces of wood, but for the farmers who use them, those sticks are part of a much larger system. The process usually begins in late autumn. When the growing season is over and the trees have gone dormant, branches are cut from mature Osage orange trees. Farmers typically select pieces about the thickness of a wrist. Thick enough to last, but light enough to handle easily. Those branches are then stored through the winter in a dry barn or shed. This curing period allows the wood to stabilize while preserving the natural oils locked inside the timber. Then spring arrives. The ground softens. The garden beds are prepared for planting. And before the seedlings begin to grow, the wooden stakes are placed into the soil. Not randomly, but with deliberate spacing. Many gardeners place them around the outer edges of the garden, creating a loose perimeter. Others position them throughout the beds, forming a grid that spreads the scent across the entire growing space. The exact spacing can vary depending on the size of the garden, but the general idea is simple. Each piece of wood releases a small cloud of natural compounds into the surrounding air. When enough stakes are placed across the garden, those small clouds begin to overlap. Together, they create a broader zone that insects seem reluctant to enter. It's not perfect. No garden defense system ever is. Different climates attract different pests. Some insects are more sensitive than others. But many gardeners who experiment with the method report something interesting. They don't necessarily eliminate every insect. Instead, they often notice fewer infestations, less damage, healthier leaves, and sometimes the difference is surprisingly noticeable. What's important to understand is that the stick method isn't meant to be a magical solution. It works best as part of a larger gardening philosophy, one that focuses on balance instead of domination. Healthy soil, diverse plants, natural deterrents. When those elements work together, the garden begins to protect itself, and those simple wooden stakes become one small piece of a much bigger system, quietly working beneath the surface. When you step back and look at methods like this, something interesting begins to emerge. The real lesson may not be about a specific tree or a specific stick placed in the soil. It's about how we think about pest control in the first place. For a long time, modern gardening has framed pests as enemies in a battle. The insects arrive. The gardener fights back, sprays stronger chemicals, apply new treatments, repeat every season. But nature rarely works like a battlefield. In natural ecosystems, balance is created through layers of interaction. Plants defend themselves. Predator insects hunt pests. Soil microbes strengthen plant roots. Birds feed on larvae hiding beneath the leaves. Instead of one solution, nature uses dozens of small defenses working together. And when gardeners begin to copy those systems, something remarkable often happens. The garden becomes far more resilient. You start to see fewer catastrophic pest outbreaks. Not because insects disappear entirely, but because the environment stops favoring them. That's why many experienced growers combine several natural strategies at once. They plant flowers that attract beneficial insects. They rotate crops so pests can't establish permanent homes. They improve soil health so plants grow stronger and more resistant. And occasionally, they experiment with old techniques like the Osage orange stakes. Not because they expect a miracle, but because every small layer of protection adds to the overall balance of the garden. In that sense, the so-called stick method isn't really about sticks at all. It's a reminder that agriculture once relied heavily on observation. Farmers paid attention to the behavior of insects. They watched how plants interacted with their environment. And over time, they built systems that allowed nature itself to do much of the work. When we start to rediscover those ideas, gardening begins to feel less like a fight and more like a partnership with the land. And when you look at the story of those quiet wooden stakes in the soil, the lesson becomes bigger than just one gardening trick. Because the truth is, the stick itself is not the most important part of the story. The real story is about knowledge. For most of human history, farming knowledge didn't come from laboratories or instruction manuals. It came from watching the land, season after season. Farmers noticed which plants attracted insects. They noticed which trees insects avoided. They experimented with what they had around them. A branch here, a hedgerow there, a new planting pattern the following year. Over time, those observations became traditions. Simple methods that helped families grow food year after year without relying on expensive inputs. But as agriculture became more industrial, many of those small discoveries faded into the background. Modern farming focused on scale, efficiency, and chemical precision. And while those innovations helped feed millions of people, they also shifted the way we think about growing food. The idea that a solution could come from something as simple as a branch from a tree started to sound unrealistic. Yet when we step back and look at nature itself, we see the same principle everywhere. Plants defend themselves with chemistry. Forests balance insect populations naturally. Healthy ecosystems regulate pests without constant intervention. The Amish gardeners who continue using methods like this aren't necessarily rejecting modern knowledge. They're simply holding on to something older. A belief that sometimes the land already contains the solutions we're searching for. You just have to pay attention long enough to notice them. So the next time you walk through a garden and see a few rough wooden stakes standing quietly in the soil, you might look at them a little differently. Not as random pieces of wood, but as reminders of a long tradition of farmers who learned to work with nature instead of against it. And maybe that's the most powerful idea hidden inside this entire story. Because in the end, the goal of gardening isn't to eliminate every insect on the planet. The goal is much simpler: to create a garden so balanced, so healthy, and so well designed that the pests simply decide to go somewhere else.